thank you for being here. I'm going to be talking about my sort of journey with GraphQL. So my and my team's journey with GraphQL and the problems we had and how GraphQL helped us solve it. So sort of, like I said, me and my team's journey with GraphQL and perhaps reasons why you might, start a journey with GraphQL. So, who am I? I'm Faduma. I'm a software engineer at Condé Nast International. I love GraphQL, and you can send me GraphQL memes or ask me questions at Faduma Faralaiga at Twitter. But first, before we begin, what the fudge cake is GraphQL? You might be sitting here thinking, actually, Faduma, hold your horses. I don't even know what GraphQL is. Before you even get to the problems, how it helped you. So I'm going to do a slight sort of GraphQL 101. It's going to be high level, but it's just so that you can, come with me in this journey so I can explain to you how GraphQL helped us fix the problems we had. So what is GraphQL? GraphQL describes itself as a query language for the API. So what does that mean? Basically, that is just a language for requesting data from your server. It's just a different syntax for requesting data. So what's the differences between REST versus GraphQL? With REST, you have multiple sort of endpoints. As a developer, if you've created a REST API, you're probably used to it. You create sort of like a /articles endpoint, and then you create a /galleries endpoint, and then you continue. But with GraphQL, you have one multi-purpose endpoint, such as /GraphQL. With REST, the endpoints give you a sort of predefined set of data. So when you go to /articles, the developer already decided what sort of data to give you for that endpoint. But with GraphQL, the client can request a certain set of data they want. So they can pick and choose what they want. There's a schema that sort of defines what your API is. So you define sort of what types it is, what queries people can make, and what data is available to them. So that's just basically sort of the schema side. So the client, how does it communicate with this API? It makes a query. It goes, hey, from the articles, I just want the head. So that's how it communicates with your API, your GraphQL API. So that's a very high level explanation of what GraphQL is. So let's get to my sort of GraphQL journey. So some context. Like I said, I'm a developer for Condé Nast International, and Condé Nast International is a publishing company that owns very famous brands like GQ and Vogue. And GQ is not a magazine about GraphQL, by the way. And this is our beautiful Vogue website that I helped build, and it uses the GraphQL API. So this is what our app used to look like. We have an API from a content management system that editors use to write their content. So this sort of content management API interacts with our happy server. There's a Redux store, and we server-side render our application. So this is the structure of our application previously. So what are the problems we had? First of all, a lot of our components were very tied to our API response. This is a sort of more illustrative example of it. It wasn't as extreme as this, but this component, for example, this title component is taking the whole API response and basically sort of presenting one of the fields. So this is very typical behavior where you get the request and then you just shove it to a component, and then the component just sort of renders whatever. So why is this bad? If our API changes, we'd have to go update all of those components. And that's a freaking pain. So for example, if the API developer now, instead of having title field, decides they want a head field, we would have to go through all our application and then change those sort of reference to it. It's less readable. It's not very clear as to what the sort of, component needs and what it's getting. What's inside API response? Like, it's not very clear. And our components know way too much about their context. And context, I mean like where the data is fetched from, what kind of shape it is in. Basically they're way too work. They need to chill, step back a little bit. Ideally, we would have a few components that sort of know about their context, but most of them should have no idea what they are involved in. Should live in blissful ignorance. So if you're familiar with the sort of concept of presentational and container components, this is probably be familiar to you. So with presentational components, you would have, so they know nothing about their context, they have no state or dependencies, they're basically sort of taking data and display it. Whilst, and this is an example of that, so the title component will just take in text and then display the text. Simples. While container components know some bit of their context, right? They are often sort of generated by higher order components, and they, an example of this is the article component, where it's sort of taking data and then sending it specific ones to its children. We didn't really enforce this sort of pattern very strictly, and our components knew way too much. Ideally, even your container component shouldn't really know about a third-party API. More on this later. Basically, we need to refactor our components. Another problem we had was that we sent way too much data to our client. This is like a GIF of all the one of our requests that we get. And yeah, it's enormous. Why is this bad? You must be asking. It's confusing. What am I getting? It's hard to traverse this huge object. And I don't need all this information. Sometimes I just only need GRUSP just using basically one or two fields. And it affects performance. Your browser doesn't need to download all this information. Think about that poor person in Timbuktu with a mobile, phone. They don't need all this data. And there's some security risks where if, for example, the API developer wants to send us a sensitive field, we're basically sending it straight to a client. There are some things you can do to mitigate this risk, but the moral of the story is that we should not be sending this data to our client. Another issue that we had was that if we switched data sources, our whole application would have to be rewritten. Pretty much everything in our app was tied to this third-party API. If we switch CMSs, we have to throw everything away and rewrite everything. So for example, if our pink API here changed to a rainbow API, our application would be so confused. You wouldn't know what happened. So why is this bad? Technology changes. Your app needs to be resilient. It's a business risk coupling your application to third-party services. We needed to consciously decouple. Another problem we faced was that the API was really difficult to work with. It had some little quirks, but this is a thing with all third-party APIs, right? Because they were not built for just me. They have multiple consumers, so it doesn't really quite 100% work with your needs. And so these are some of the problems we faced. Some of the field names didn't really make sense to us. There was so much data. Remember this GIF? Enormous amounts. And the data was not formatted in the way that we needed it. For example, the body field it came back as Markdown, and that's not really that useful for me, for us anyway. And there was no documentation. Documentation is hard when it's done by humans, so it's understandable. Third-party APIs are never going to be perfect. There's always going to be challenges with them. Another problem that our team faced was that we were fetching data in complicated ways from deep trees in the API request. So, for example, if we wanted to render an article, article about Meghan Markle, this is sort of process that we would have to go through. We would have to first make a request for the Meghan Markle article. We would have to go get some published information so we can send it to our analytics. We need to go get the contributor, Faduma. We have to go get the categories about this article, what category this article is in. We need to go get some recommendations for this article. And then with the recommendation API, it only sends like IDs for the article, so we have to fetch all those articles as well. And then we'd have to like smush all this data to present this Meghan Markle article. So why is this bad? This is too much cognitive overload. You're trying to remember where each data is coming from. And it's hard to like navigate these complex relationships between these objects. We had to make requests, multiple requests in our main application. And if you're doing client side, this is not going to be performant. And it's harder to debug. If a problem happens between any of these any of these requests, it would be hard to figure out where and what the issue is. This was a lot to deal with. Clearly, we had issues. So, how did we solve those issues? First of all, we had a spike to prototype sort of different solutions. One of them was a purely domain-driven sort of design. And the other one was GraphQL. And spoiler alert, we chose GraphQL. So this is, if you remember, this is how our application looks like. It's making a request from a content a CMS. There's a happy server with a Redux store, and with server-side rendering our application. Now, essentially, previously, this is where the business logic existed, right? So this is where all the stuff was happening. Now, with the GraphQL, we have this sort of GraphQL layer that shields our application. So we use Apollo for creating our GraphQL schema, and we're still serving our application with Happy, and we're making our queries using Apollo client, and we're still server-side rendering our application. Essentially, we've just moved our business logic here, right? So this sort of GraphQL layer takes care of all this sort of data fetching and transformation. So what did GraphQL give us? First of all, it gave us instant documentation. GraphQL ecosystem has like amazing tools that allow you to connect it to your schema and create documentation out of it. There's tools like GraphQL and GraphQL Playground so that you can sort of explore what your API is giving back. This is a screenshot of GraphQL Playground, so which is very similar to if you've used like Postman for REST APIs. This is kind of similar concept. But here you can see sort of our schema here, and clearly you can see all the queries that you can make, sort of the arguments that are included and their types, whether they're required or not, and the data that you can get back from this query. So you can get one or more of these data. And you can see here I'm only getting ID. So now, actually, our documentation is actually useful, and it stays up to date with no effort. So if we change our schema, our documentation stays up to date. We now know sort of what data we can get from our client side. Like we can, use the information, our data much more, usefully. We no longer have to sort of fetch data with multiple requests in our main application. This is one of the benefits that we found with GraphQL. So if you remember that Meghan Markle article and the cascading requests that we had to make, now we just have to make one query and we get everything that we need. And our data is actually in a clear, consistent way, we request it in a clear, consistent way. We still have to make the same request, but now it exists in our GraphQL layer. And our React application doesn't really know about all this complication. Our lives are a little bit more easier now that we have to think about just one query. One of the benefits that we found with GraphQL is that it encourages really good sort of patterns of structuring your application. We started fetching data. We started fetching only the data we needed. We stripped out all our business logic from our components and had true separation of concerns. We started using field name that actually made sense to our application. On our UI, most importantly, our UI is no longer dependent on this third-party API. Disclaimer, we could have done this without GraphQL, and you could do this without GraphQL. If we were more disciplined, we could avoid some of these problems. There are programming patterns that sort of enforce this sort of structure, like domain-driven design and hexagonal architecture. However, GraphQL sort of enforces these patterns without having developers police themselves. GraphQL allows you to follow these patterns without having to think about it. One of the hugest benefits that we got from GraphQL is that now we have assurance that if our third-party API changes, our application is resilient. It's not going to be affected. So, scenario: if Condé Nast, decides to switch CMSs to WordPress, for example. So, if this pink API changes to a red API, the change of data source only affects our GraphQL layer. And our React application is shielded from this. So the impact is really just that the field in our schema was just resolved to a different data source than it previously was. So if our API is sort of rewritten, our application is resilient. We are resilient to change. We can now react to changes in technology without us being completely devastated. So why might you want to use GraphQL? For example, if you might want to use GraphQL if you have a sort of a set of data that is needed by multiple clients, right? Multiple applications. For example, a mobile app and a web app. GraphQL is very product friendly. And what I mean by that is that it lowers the barrier for entry for new sort of consumers of your API. Because it reduces the burden of having to just sort of make those perform those logic in the application. So here, if both of these sort of applications, the web app and the mobile app, needed to make request the API, the business logic would exist in both of these scenarios, right? The mobile app would have to make the request and then stitch up the data that it needs, and then similar scenario for the web app. But with GraphQL, it can do that sort of logic itself, and both of your sort of consumers will just request the data it needs. So the business logic exists here now. And it doesn't really force a specific way to consume your API. So it gives a little bit more flexibility as to what kind of data that you need and you can request. So our web app, if we were showing our sort of beauty category page, it could make a category query and request sort of all the articles it needs and the images connect to it. But a mobile app is free to make the same query, but only get the images. So it can behave differently. So your application can be totally different, but seamlessly use the same set of data. Another reason why you might start a GraphQL journey is that you're building an application that has like sort of multiple data sources. So scenario, Condé Nast might, some decide that they need like a shoe API. We need to show shoes on the Vogue website now, and there's going to be a shoe feed. Like, how would we do that? So now we have another extra data source, right? We have another API that we have to consume. You can build a GraphQL layer that sort of fetches this data from all these sources. And you can combine them, and your actual web application will only interface with one sort of API. GraphQL and REST are not mutually exclusive. Like, we were using a REST API for our content management system. So you can get data from loads of different places, including REST APIs. So you can get data from REST APIs, other GraphQL APIs, databases, JSON in your file system. And then what the GraphQL layer would do is just, when it needs something from one data source, it will go get it from there, and the other from the other data source, and your React application or your application in general will just only have to interact with this. It doesn't really know about this confusing scenario going on behind the scenes. So you basically resolve, your resolver function will just handle this complication behind the scenes. Like I said, this sort of GraphQL layer will just handle that complication. Meanwhile, your front end is just living its sweet GraphQL life. It doesn't really know about this confusion, just living its blissful ignorance. Another sort of another benefit that you might find with GraphQL is that it allows you to structure your code base in a good way. So GraphQL encourages good habits. It will help you separate your concerns, encourages removing logic from your third-party APIs from your client application. Another reason why you might use GraphQL is that if you have a REST API, like a pseudo-GraphQL API anyway, so what I mean by that is that if you have like an endpoint that fetches fields in a query parameter, like this, where you have /articles, and you have a query parameter, and it's requesting different fields, it's basically GraphQL anyway. So why not just make it GraphQL? And another great reason is that it's because it's fun, and everyone else is doing it. This alone is not a good reason, but combined with the other, amazing reasons I presented, hopefully it'll make a compelling, reason why you might start your GraphQL journey. So thank you. I'm Faduma, and